From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Congressional Budget Office projects that the U.S. will add more than $20 trillion to the debt in the next decade, while spending more on interest payments to national defense. Plus, the House impeaches Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas as Democrat Tom Suozzi runs away with a New York special election to replace George Santos. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The budget brains at the CBO are often the bearers of bad news lately. And let's start with some testimony by CBO Director Philip Swagel, who's on Capitol Hill today, giving some of his short-term projection, including a slowdown in economic growth.
The U.S. economy grew faster in 2023 than it did in 2022, even as inflation slowed. We do see economic growth slowing in 2024 with slightly higher unemployment and continued lower inflation. We expect the Federal Reserve, to eventually respond by reducing interest rates starting around the middle of the calendar year.
What's even more worrying to me, though, Alicia, are these long-term projections from the CBO. An agency recently issued a report that's titled The Budget and Economic Outlook 2024 to 2034. And Alicia, what are your big takeaways from this document the CBO is warning about?
Well, I think, first of all, that the fiscal situation is only going to get worse. The last year reported a $2 trillion deficit. And actually what the CBO projects is that the debt over the next 10 years will grow to about $48.3 trillion in 2034 from $26.2 in this last fiscal year. Now, if you think about it, that's about a $22 trillion increase in just over the last 10 years, which is about as much debt the U.S. piled on in its entire history through the year 2021. And by the way, that included the first year of the pandemic when it was piled on a lot of debt. So the debt in deficits are going to keep growing much faster. That's one big takeaway. A second is that it isn't a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. Revenues are expected to actually average 17.8% of GDP through 2034 compared to the 17.3% average over the last 50 years. It's rarely, the highest it's ever really gotten is just a little over 18%. But the spending is expected to average 23.5% GDP, which is a lot more than the 50-year average of 21%. And that's largely because of entitlement spending, mainly Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And as the baby boomers age and retire, Medicare and Social Security spending is going to increase. And not only that, Medicaid spending has been increasing at a much faster rate. And some of that is because of the national emergency, which added many more individuals to the Medicaid rolls, and the states have been somewhat slow to remove them even after the emergency ended. But turns out is that the beneficiaries of these programs are also using a lot more healthcare than expected. And they're also, CBO projects that more seniors are living longer, so spending is also going to increase. So that's a big takeaway. Third, CBO, its baseline projections assume, by the way, that the 2017 tax cuts expire and that a lot of programs, or the IRA, for instance, the IRA's Obamacare subsidies also expire in 2025. And that's very unlikely. So you're probably going to see trillions of dollars in more spending and probably somewhat lower revenues, assuming that some of the tax cuts, I would assume at least the middle class tax cuts in the 2017 reform get extended for probably another 10 years or so. And I think that the third big takeaway is that this is unsustainable because right now with the interest rates, and you recall the debt basically and deficits, they compound and the interest, therefore it necessarily increases. And by the year 2034, interest payments are expected to grow to about $1.6 trillion. Just to put that in perspective, that's about almost twice as much as we are now currently spending on national defense. And so really that could essentially buy hundreds of new warships. But instead, we're going to be spending on servicing the national debt. And again, this just isn't sustainable from a fiscal standpoint. And invariably, the Congress is going to have to step in, if only to prevent the Medicare and Social Security trust funds from going broke, and pass some kind of reforms. And that will probably include a big tax hike It may be very modest adjustments to benefits.
Kim, to me, this report busts some myths. And the first of them that Alicia already mentioned is that this is not a spending problem, because it clearly is a spending problem. And I get if people don't want to go read through a long, dry, boring CBO report, but you can pull this up and just look at some of the charts that the CBO presents here. And one of them is average revenues and average outlays. It goes back to 1974. And the average revenues from that 1974 to 2023 was 17.3% of GDP. And then the projection for the year 2024 is 17.5% of GDP. So a little bit above trend there. And if you look at outlays, on the other hand, the average from 1974 to 2023 is 21% of GDP. And now we're on a trend line where by 2034, the CBO is projecting it will be 24% of GDP. And so you have this situation in this chart where revenues are basically on trend with where they have been for decades. And the line for outlays is continuing to go up. I'd add also on this revenue point that these averages hold under a whole different variety of tax regimes that we've had. If you go back and look at the personal income tax, the rate on it in the late 70s and even into 1980, the top income tax rate in the United States was 70%. But despite that, the U.S. tax code was full of loopholes and carve-outs. And so there was not a hugely larger amount of revenue being raised. We are still basically on trend with where we were then. A second myth is that this spending is not being driven by entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, because again, it clearly is. And the chart here to look at from the CBO is this graph of mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. And mandatory back in the 70s, early 80s was under or about 10% of GDP. And that includes these social programs. And now we're on a trend line where it is going to go up to 15% of the economy. And discretionary, on the other hand, is what you think of in terms of congressional appropriations, which also includes defense spending and the Pentagon. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was about 10% of GDP. And now we are on a trend line where it is going to be about half that. The CBO projects 5.1% in 2034. And Kim, I think that's also explanatory because it helps people figure out why Congress is at each other's throats in these kinds of spending fights over every dollar of discretionary and defense spending. Part of the solution here, part of what answers the question is because these mandatory figures are going up so much that they are crowding out all other parts of the federal budget.
I mean, this is just basic math, and there's a way to put it into a context that the average household understands because they have to do it every day with their own budgeting. You know, you sit down and look, those two numbers that you said, if your revenue coming in is about 18% of GDP, and you're spending at a level of 23% of GDP, there's your mismatch right there. More money is going out the door than is coming in. And then you imagine a pie chart and you look at where all your spending is going. And as you note, an increasingly small wedge of it is going to discretionary programs, which, by the way, are the things that Congress loves to spend on. That's where all the fun is because they get to decide where it goes and their different priorities. That is becoming a smaller and smaller piece because mandatory is just ballooning as the size of the pie on autopilot, by the way, because as you note, no one will do anything to try to reform those programs. I would also note that one of the reasons that we're in as dire a situation as we are right now, and these numbers look so bad, it says something about how quickly Congress can make a mess. An enormous part of how ugly these numbers are were simply the years in which we were dealing with COVID. Prior to COVID, the last fiscal year budget we had, we spent $4.4 trillion on the federal government. In fiscal 2020, we spent 6.6, and in fiscal 2021, we spent 6.8. That's an additional $5 trillion. And it brings up another piece of this CBO report that I think is really important, which is the level of our debt at the moment and the increasing amount of the pie that's also being taken up by the interest payments to service that debt. So this fiscal year alone, we're going to spend $870 billion servicing that debt. That is more, just to put this in perspective, than we are spending on defense this year. And by 2034, according to that CBO report, that number is going to approximately double to $1.6 trillion of fiscal year. That's 3.9% of GDP. And, a lot of this is because we are already looking at, existing debt of 20-some trillion dollars, a lot of which got piled on just in recent years. And yet we have a Congress that has shown no willingness to try to pull back some of those levels. Just as an interesting side note, when I wrote my book this last year, I went and looked back, as bad as those numbers are, I went back and looked at what the Biden administration had proposed spending in just its first 2 years of office. Thank God a lot of it was not enacted, but they proposed $22 trillion worth of spending in just 2 years. And that tells you a little bit about Congress's appetite to keep going rather than rein it back.
Hang tight. We'll be right back with more on this in a moment. Welcome back. Alicia, you used the word unsustainable to describe the situation a moment ago, and I agree with that, but that's part of what makes the political response to this, or lack thereof, so odd to me, because it is clear that these programs are heading for a crash and in not too distant of a future. So if you go back and look at the most recent trustees report for the Social Security program, it says that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will be able to pay 100% of total scheduled benefits until 2033. At that time, the fund's reserves will become depleted and continuing program income will be sufficient to pay 77% of scheduled benefits. And so what that translates to is in 2033, we're staring down the barrel of a 23% automatic cut in Social Security payments going out to seniors. And 2033 is not that far away. If you think about the next president, if the next president were to win, and we have potentially two incumbents running, but if you had a two-term president, that would be at the end of their second term. They would leave office in 2033 after the 2024 election. And so, Alicia, it is a bit boggling to me that neither party is willing to take up this issue and say, we can't delay this anymore. We have to change Social Security in order to fix and save Social Security. Otherwise, we're talking about a cut of almost a quarter coming here within a decade.
So a couple of points here. One is that I think Congress, is continually kick this can down the road. One, because they don't want to get beat up in political campaigns for even proposing or suggesting anything that could be interpreted as, quote unquote, cutting Social Security or Medicare. You recall how much flack Paul Ryan got in 2012 when he was Mitt Romney's running mate, because he had proposed this premium assistant model for reforming Medicare to put it on a more sustainable track. And there were actually ads run that showed Paul Ryan pushing an elderly woman off a cliff. But Trump also used it to try to beat up Nikki Haley, who had proposed extending the retirement age gradually for young people. And this was deemed that she was trying to slash entitlements. And Ron DeSantis also went after her for that. So members of both political parties are very leery of even touching this third rail because they don't want to get knocked up over it in either a primary or a general election. What I think will probably end up happening is, I think I mentioned earlier, you'll probably get some deal to raise taxes, especially for the Social Security. Maybe they eliminate the current wage cap, and which would end up being a huge tax increase, marginal tax increase for higher earners. And then maybe some modest adjustments to benefits, like an increase in the retirement age for those who are currently young. And you have to remember also that these trust funds are to some extent political, artifacts. What Congress could technically do is just rewrite the law and say, no, the benefits aren't going to be cut. We're just going to backfill this with general fund revenue. And I could see that happening as well.
Kim, what about this idea that you sometimes hear of a fiscal commission that could get together and propose some changes to these programs or broader federal budgeting as a way to give each of the political parties a little bit of cover. And notable that the House Budget Committee is advancing a bill to create a fiscal commission. It went through the committee last month, 22-12, and 3 Democrats voted yes.
I'm really old. If I had a nickel for every time Congress was going to make a fiscal commission, I wouldn't be doing this job. I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere drinking a margarita. But yes, we have another idea for a commission. This was an idea that got rolling during the debate last year when we were putting together the debt ceiling bill. Now had the committee advance it, 22-12, 3 Democrats joining Republicans. Many Democrats did not want to take part in this, did not want to vote for it because they believe that any commission is simply going to suggest cuts. And of course, any commission should be suggesting cuts, but they see this as a political opportunity to somehow equate a vote for a commission as going along the same routes Alicia was just describing as a way to attack Republicans preemptively, to suggest that they want to get rid of Granny and throw her off the cliff by cutting Social Security or Medicare. The problem with these commissions is, in theory, they're a great idea. And yes, do we want to have some mechanism that requires Congress to think hard about cuts? Yes, except for that very rarely do the recommendations or the reports that come out of these commissions actually result in any action. And the other thing that's very frustrating about this is that often these commissions, kind of like when we've had balanced budget debates in Congress, there is a preference in the end because when really faced with cuts or reform, no one has much courage. The easy thing to do, as Alicia said, is to lean heavily on raising revenues, even though that can have a deadly cost to the economy, and shy away from some of the big dramatic things that you would need to do to make a real difference. The pity of that is that you would think that a commission, a report, would be the place where members of Congress could feel most emboldened to make some broad recommendations, some big sweeping changes, because it's not binding. They're not voting on it. But it's remarkable how people are nervous about even attaching their names to such a project.
But the difficulty is that the sooner you make these kinds of changes, Alicia, the less painful they can be. And the conversation here suggests that maybe the political system is just not ready for that, not willing to take it up at this point. And what that essentially means is that Congress is not going to deal with this problem until it becomes a crisis. There is no averting the crisis. We're just going to have to wait until we get there. And Alicia, we'll give you the last word on this topic, but that means that the cuts and the tax increases and so forth, whatever the final deal is to avert this problem and to save these programs, it's going to be more painful than it would be if we did it now or if we had done it 10 years ago.
Right. And I think we actually haven't considered at least one other option, I think, for Medicare. And you're already seeing this. And the Biden administration has proposed or has pushed through cuts to both to Medicare Advantage plans and now physician fees. Actually, in 2015, the cuts to the physician fees were mandated by Congress in order to achieve budget neutrality. But the result of that is that you're going to get actually seniors are going to have less access to care. And that's already happening. And now the Medicare Advantage plans, which are kind of private insurance plans that now cover about half of Medicare beneficiaries, they're talking about cutting back benefits and they're going to further restrict their networks of providers. And what else the Biden administration has been doing is, by the way, they have restricted access to Alzheimer's drugs because they are, quote unquote, too expensive. And so you're going to see a lot more rationed care, at least in the Medicare program, in order to try to reduce costs because they don't want to actually grapple with reforming this program.